He's the author of the award-winning cookbooks and nonfiction narratives. We're talking about Chef Thomas Keller's seminal The French Laundry Cookbook, as well as the highly successful series about the training of chefs, The Making of a Chef, The Soul of a Chef, and The Reach of a Chef. He is also the author of The Elements of Cooking and Ratio, and he's making his young adult debut in If You Can't Take the Heat, which is available for purchase just next week, so you can pre-order it right downstairs. He has worked at the New York Times and is a food columnist for the Los Angeles Times. He's attended the Culinary Institute of America and is the author of 18 books about food and cooking, and also such wide-ranging subjects as a pediatric heart surgeon and building wooden boats. He lives with his wife, you know her and you love her, Ann Hood, in New York City and Providence, Rhode Island. So let's give Michael Ruhlman a big round of applause before he teaches us information.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, Ann. First, I want to thank people for doing a double header today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for sticking around.
That's good. It's nice to see everybody still.
Try and keep it lively.
Yeah, right. Well, then we should talk about cocktails. That'll keep it lively.
Happily, that's the subject.
So before we talk about cocktails, I wanted you to talk about the Ratio Cookbook, because I think it's a good background piece of information.
Sure. When I was researching my book, The Soul of a Chef, the Making of a Chef, in which I spent 9 months at the Culinary Institute of America in White's learning to cook. And I did learn to cook, and that's why I was able to become a cook, actually, eventually, when I couldn't sell a book. But one of the guys I interviewed was Uwe Hessnar, one of the older chefs there, and he was lamenting all the cookbooks on his shelf and all the food TV, and the internet wasn't really a thing yet, but his shelves were buckling. He says, I can show you everything that's in these books, plus Escoffier, plus Carême, plus all of Julia Child in a page and a half. Would you like to see it? Yes, I would like to see that. And he spun around in his chair and pulled out an old metal filing cabinet drawer and pulled out 2 sheets of paper with a list of ratios on them. And a ratio is not a recipe, it's the basic proportions of standard preparations. For instance, it had, for a hollandaise sauce or an emulsified butter sauce, and there are many, Bernays and Chiron, but for hollandaise it said 3 yolks, 1 pound of butter. And that was it. It was on a grid, 2, 4, 6, 8, and the preparations went down the side. And what I loved about this is that he reduced these fancy preparations to their essentials. In culinary school, you season a hollandaise with lemon, you add salt, sometimes you make a reduction using vinegar, adding that. This was devoid of all that, but I realized that, well, if you took away the reduction or the vinegar or the lemon juice, do you still have an emulsified butter sauce? Well, yes, you do. It's not that flavorful, but you've got an emulsified butter sauce. Take away the butter or the yolk, and you didn't. And I found this idea of turning it, a recipe, into this diamond idea. And so I set out to explore all these ratios and wrote about them in a book.
Did it win the James Beard Award?
No, it did not. Damn them. I don't even think it was nominated.
I thought it did.
It might have, no. Ruhlman's 21.
Oh, Ruhlman's 20.
I won a magazine Beard Award, and the Bouchon Cookbook also won.
Okay, I knew you'd won 3. I put this one in. And then you were nominated for Egg.
I was nominated for, I've been nominated. Yes, Egg was nominated.
It's an honor even to be nominated.
It is. It is. Because this cocktail book is not, goddamn that.
I know, he's so mad when the nominations came out. All right, we'll get to the cocktail book in a minute, but you've opened up so many other questions. So, how did you land? You were a writer, you had worked at the New York Times. How did you end up at the Culinary Institute of America?
I'd been cooking since I was 4. Not 4, I was in 4th grade. I was an only child, and in the winter in 1972, all we had was pretzels.
In Cleveland.
In Cleveland, all we had was pretzels and pop, as we called it. And in 4th grade, a home ec class, she taught us how to make what I now know as a Spanish tortilla or torta, which is eggs, like a potato egg omelet that's just in one pan. And I made one for myself at home, and it was so good. It's like, I can't believe this. It was so much better than a bag of pretzels. And I felt better after having eaten it. And then I was, again, I'm home alone by myself watching TV. What's on TV? Nothing but Julia Child. And I was watching Julia Child one day, and she made, her great genius was to make cooking seem easy and accessible. And she made an apple pie, and she made me feel like I could make an apple pie. And I thought, I'm gonna make an apple pie. But it was 1972 in Cleveland, and there's no fresh fruit in Cleveland in 1972, but we did have some canned pears. We had flour, we had Crisco shortening, and I made a pear tart. And it was terrible. But my father came home, and he was an ad man. He looked like Don Draper. He set his briefcase down by the back door, and he said, "Dad, I made a pear tart." He said, "What?" And he looked at it. He took a bite. He said, "You made a pear tart?" And he said, "Yeah." He says, "Wow." So I was praised for the effort. So I think that was the beginning of my cooking days. I always cooked, and I worked in Cleveland, and I wrote a column, Cooking with Chefs. And when after I'd published my first book, I thought maybe I should take this column where I cooked with chefs and learned how they cook, not just their recipes. I could do a book about that. So I went to the Culinary Institute and began in Skills 1, where you learn how to peel a carrot and dice an onion, and then how to make a hollandaise, how to make a bechamel sauce, and all that you can do from there.
And boy, can he dice an onion. If I'm cooking and I need an onion diced,
Michael!
Every size, every piece, exactly the same size, mine are awesome. Willy-nilly. But you left out an important part, I think, because you didn't just go there. How did you get into the Culinary Institute?
Oh, well, I had to write to them, and I actually, even before, they wouldn't let me in. They thought I was trying to scam a free education, I found out later. Because I couldn't pay for it. I was a journalist. It was like as I recall, $40,000 advance. For the whole advance was $40,000 for the book, which had to last for a year at least. And time was running out. 6 months were, 6 months I was waiting, and finally there was no choice. But I decided to move my ex-wife and my baby daughter to Tivoli, New York, right near the Hudson Valley, near the CIA, to show them that I was serious. I showed up there, and they couldn't deny me anymore. And finally, at the beginning of that year, they let me in, and I learned how to cook. I learned very quickly that you couldn't know what it meant to be a chef unless you actually became one, because so many changes were internal. It's about how you thought about things, how you approached a challenge, how aware you were of others around you. And so I was probably the best student there, because I interviewed everybody. I reported everything, but I also learned to cook. And after I got out of there, I was looking for a cook's job, and I walked into a barbecue joint in the middle of Ohio, because I'd heard this woman was really well connected with chefs. She could tell me who the best chef in Cleveland would be to work for. She looked at me, looked at my materials, and said, "Oh my God, I didn't know you did all this. I'm working with Thomas Keller at the French Laundry, and we're looking for a cookbook writer." So a broke, unemployed, unknown, the book hadn't come out yet, broke, unemployed, unknown writer walks into a barbecue joint in the middle of Ohio and walks out with tickets to the best restaurant in the country. In the world at the time, to write the man's cookbook. And there I saw not only what you could do with the fundamentals, but what those fundamentals could do in the hands of a brilliant, imaginative chef. And that's how I became a food writer.
I think a lot of your story is about the time that it happened. Can you talk about that?
The time that it happened, the reason why I think I could sell that book about culinary school is suddenly the whole country was becoming more and more interested in chefs and their work. One, our food was making us sick. There are all kinds of food-related illnesses, and who do we look to answer these questions? That's one reason I think chefs became so important in our culture. Also, people were just becoming interested in food and cooking. So when I got out of the Culinary Institute, and certainly after I finished writing the French Laundry Cookbook, I had two things that no one else had. Some had one, others had the other, but very few had both. I was a writer and a journalist. I could write. I could write like a bandit because I'd been practicing for 20 years with no success for 20 years until I sold my first book. And I knew I had a culinary education. I knew the fundamentals, so I knew what I was talking about in a subject that more and more people were aware of.
Because the Food Network had started, right?
Food Network had just started. It had started in '94.
Yeah.
I went to school in '96.
Yeah.
And that's how it happened.
Yeah. But you had published 2 books before this, Wooden Boats and the School?
No, I published one.
Oh,
I published one book. When I was writing for that magazine for which I had the chef's column, I wrote a book about my old all-boy high school because it had been taken over by my old history teacher, now the headmaster, who was arguing forcefully that all male education could be a great thing. And in 1993, this was unheard of. Anything all girl was fabulous. Anything all male was toxic, of course. But here was a guy saying, no, if you do it right, it's really effective. And it's available to the people who need it. It's unavailable to the people who need it most. That is, kids who can't afford a private school, because you can't have private single sex.
Right, right. And so that was your first book?
So Boys Themselves, A Return to Single Sex Education was my first book.
Which got a really good New York Times review.
Which got a great New York Times review, compared me to Tracy Kidder and John McPhee, 2 of my heroes, and I was off and running.
Right. I love that story. Will you also tell the story about the snowstorm and the test?
Sure.
That's why you're up here.
It really is. This one day changed my life. It was at the end of Skills 1. Again, we learned how to peel a carrot, dice an onion, make a hollandaise, clarify a consommé, and we were being tested on these. And I was looking forward to writing. You know, it's a test, it's a dramatic test. It's gonna be a good scene in the book. So I really want to do it. But this was the winter of '96, and we were getting blizzard upon blizzard, and from New York City all the way through up into the Hudson Valley. And on the day of the test, I had an PM class, so I started at 2, and by 11 o'clock, I mean, coming home the next day, it was snowing, and a blizzard was already there. I actually spun out. I did the 360 on Route 9, and was lucky to make it home. So the following morning, it's still snowing. Everything is shut down in the Hudson Valley. I called the school praying that it was shut down too. And they chuckled and said, no, we don't close. And so I called my chef, Michael Pardis, 37-year-old white guy from Connecticut, but a tough, in-your-face cook and a thinker. He liked the whys of cooking, so I liked him, and we got along. And I said, hey, chef, this is Michael. He said, hi, Michael. What can I do for you? And I said, well, obviously, I'm not going to be able to make it in today. He said, okay. I mean, the Hudson Valley is buried, as you know, and I can't get there. He says, okay. I said, chef, you got to understand, I'd get there if I could, but I can't. He said, fine. I said, no, chef, you don't understand. And he said, I'm going to cut you off right there, Michael. One of the things we're teaching at the school is not how to concasse a tomato or clarify a consommé. We're teaching that kids that, when you're a chef, you get there. And I said, well, I would get there if I could, but I can't. And he said, that's fine, Michael. You have your work, we have ours. We're chefs. We get there. We like it like that. And he hung up the phone. And my heart was pounding. And ultimately I said, okay, I got to get there. So I literally had to dip the only thing visible of my car was the passenger rear view mirror, or side view mirror. That's how dug in I was. But I dug it out. I was there 2 hours late, dripping wet from the snow. And Pardis was in my face at the school. And when I entered the kitchen, he said, I did not mean to guilt you here. I said, can I still take the test? He said, yeah, I put you in the second group. They're just starting now. And I said, hey guys, can I have some burner space? And they said, you bet. And I determined that, they say that cooking is about love, cooking is about sharing from the heart. I learned to cook out of anger. I wanted to say, fuck you. But that day, that was the day when I said, you can't write about being a chef without knowing, I'm going to become a chef. I'm going to fulfill all my duties as a writer and journalist, but I'm going to become a cook. And nine months later, I was packing up, ready to leave. I went over to Pardis's house. He fixed us a big mint julep. We sat in his backyard. And I was always careful, because I was always the writer, not a cook, and not a chef either. No one wanted, chef was a highfalutin term. To be a good cook was something that was really valuable. Anybody could be a chef, but not everybody could be a really good cook. So I was always careful of that distinction. We were having mint juleps on a lovely summer day, and I said, Chef, I just want to thank you. I know I'm just a writer, I'm not a cook. And he said, whoa, Michael, if you were working the American Bounty restaurant, it was their best restaurant, if you're working the American Bounty restaurant on a Saturday, you're a cook. And I've never felt so proud.
Story. Thank you for telling it. Now, what I would like you to talk about is, what was it like walking into the French Laundry for the first time and meeting Thomas Keller, and if you could just describe that scene for us and how you felt.
Yeah.
How many people, have people been there by any chance? Yeah, somehow.
It's a beautiful place.
Beautiful.
And I got there just in time for dinner, flew out at the last minute. That's a whole other story. I flew out last minute. I walked into the garden underneath a rose trestle, and suddenly it was like entering a different world. We were given champagne out in the garden, and the waiters, the servers had had white shirts on and long white aprons, and they were like angels. And we sat down. We were there to talk about the cookbook, and Bob Lesher and Susan Lesher, the agents of the book, Susie Heller, who'd hired me, and I were foretop there, and we just got all this food which is sort of stunning to me. And I write about the whole meal in Soul of a Chef, because it was by far a life-altering meal. I did not know you could do what he was doing with a carrot. He turned carrot into the most carroty soup I'd ever had. And not just a carrot soup, each one of us got a different soup. The brunoise, the fine dice that he used in the plate was just perfect. When he handed me an anchovy on a baked tomato, and while I didn't get the linguine and clamshell, which is one bite of linguine and clam, which Susan Lesher got, damn her, I got the anchovy, which I don't like. I don't like anchovies. But I took a bite of that, and it was fresh and dense and lemony, and with the tomato, absolutely delicious. And I thought, oh my God, this is not the world I know. A whole foie gras was presented at a table in some sort of beautiful Gewürztraminer broth. I was like, who are we? Are we the Queen of England? What is going on here? Then we all got slices of foie gras. I just never seen it. And I looked at Susan, because I'm just a hayseed from Cleveland. I looked at Susan Lesher, the consummate New Yorker and cookbook agent. He says, do you eat like this all the time? And she looked at me like, no. Anyway, it was extraordinary. And then Thomas came out to the table. And then the next day, we talked about food and cooking in his kitchen. It was just, never seen a kitchen so clean, so quiet. It was just another world. And I was very excited to be there.
And how long did it take how much time did you spend there?
The big push was 6 weeks in the winter of 1998. I spent every day there reporting it, as I would any story, reporting it, writing down people said in the kitchen, writing down observations, interviewing Keller, interviewing his chefs, interviewing his purveyors, because he wanted to tell stories. And the original cookbook was written in third person. Thomas was just a character in this, because he wanted story, not just recipe. But the editor said, no, it's got to be in Thomas's voice. People want to hear Thomas. So I transformed the entire book into first person Thomas.
There's a revision.
Yeah, it was a big revision. Anyway, I think ultimately she was right in her decision to do that.
And then we ran into Susie Heller.
And then
like last week.
Last week, Susie Heller, who changed my life. There she is on Bleecker Street. Hey, Susie. Just Michael?
It was so weird. We're going to the movies, and she was going to a sale of Italian clothing.
She works for the Jacques Pepin Foundation and was in town for a board meeting.
Yeah. So we had to get the foundation before we moved to cocktails and back to ratios. So I happen to have had the pleasure of seeing this book germinate during the pandemic, so some good things did come out of the pandemic. Do you want to talk about that?
During the pandemic, there were 4 adults in our pod, and every night as one of the activities we were doing is I'd make a new cocktail. What cocktail do you want? Any suggestions? You know, read the internet. This sounds interesting. And after about, you know, a few months of this,
every night. It was such
you start realizing, these are all, you know, these are all the same cocktail. You just change out the spirit. And I thought, these are all just the same ratio. You just different, you know, just different ingredients. What else is a cocktail but a ratio? That's about as ratio as you get. Manhattan ratio: 2 parts spirit, 1 part vermouth, sweet vermouth. That's it. A drop of bitters for seasoning. A Negroni: 1 part gin, 1 part Campari, 1 part sweet vermouth. Change that gin to whiskey, and you've got a Boulevardier. Change the whiskey to scotch in the Manhattan, and you have a Rob Roy. And so I thought, well, how many families are there? And so I looked into this, and I saw that nobody had quite done this kind of work. And that's how the idea for the book came about, and I wrote a proposal for it.
And the proposal didn't go over well.
No one was buying it. No one bought it. All my usual suspects were buying it, and I was going to give up on it. In June of the year before I would write the book, we were going to Four Rivers, New Rivers, for dinner.
Yeah.
And the chef there I knew, Bo, a great cook in Providence. If you ever go there, recommend it. He asked for my book, Ratio, the yellow book, to give to 2 of his new cooks. And I said, sure, but I don't have any. Let me order them from Amazon. They'll get here before our reservation.
Don't say that in an independent bookstore. You should have said, I'll go to bookstore 1. Right.
I should have, I'm sorry.
But it's a good thing you did.
It's a good thing I did, because here's another evil thing that Amazon is doing. I went there and I saw my book for sale, but also the audiobook. I didn't know there was an audiobook of Ratio. I called my agent, or I emailed my agent and said, there's an audio version of Ratio. Did you sell this? She said, nope. So I found out my old editor who did Ratio was gone from Scribner. I didn't know who to contact. I got some contact there. Ultimately, some woman named Kara, I presume she was in the rights department or something. I said, there's a pirated edition of Ratio on Amazon. And she said, oh my God, no, we did not license this. We will get it taken down.
It was so bad too. Like the person who read it was like monosyllabic or monotone, horrible.
And they got it taken down that day. By the next day it was down. But I wrote back to her, I said, well, since somebody thinks that there's a market for an audible version of Ratio, why don't we think about Ratio? And she said, okay, are you working on anything now that we could piggyback it on, anything we could promote it with? And I said, well, I have this proposal for a cocktail book on ratios of cocktails. And she said, can I send it to you? She said, sure. And I sent it to her, and she said, I love it. And I was in between agents at this time, so we were doing this on our own.
Yeah.
And she made me an offer of exactly what I thought I needed in order to write the book.
That was funny, very serendipitous.
And so I said, you know, I could try and move this up. This is what I hoped you would ultimately land on, so let's just go from here.
And there was another bit of serendipity.
Another bit of serendipity. At the exact same time, I got an email from an LA PR agency representing some of a watercolor artist. And I said, and line drawing. She showed me some online, and I said, sure, I'd love to see examples. So she sent me examples of this author's work, and there's a tea towel with food on it, and there was also a large 8x10 of an old-fashioned in watercolor. And I thought, oh my God, I love it. Let's do this book in watercolor. And so I sent my agent. Oh, the other thing is, I wasn't talking to the rights person. I said, I don't know who to send the proposal to. I've got a proposal, but I don't know who I'd send it to at Scribner. And she said, well, you'd send it to me. And so I quickly Googled, and she's the editor and executive editor and publisher of Scribner.
You thought she was some writer person.
Yeah, so I was very embarrassed.
So these are the families. So this is the Negroni family. You'll see it more when you look at the book closely.
Yeah, so there it is. Negroni's the name of the list. 1 ounce gin, 1 ounce sweet vermouth, 1 ounce Campari, and then the garnish. But you do a Spagliato, and it's the same, similar ingredients, and you do there's a white Negroni, same proportions, different ingredients.
But then instead of photography, there's all the watercolors of the cocktail.
I asked Kara, would you consider doing all watercolors? Because I've been looking at a lot of cocktail books, and they all have page after page of still cocktails.
Like the sweating glass.
Sweating glass, the woody bar, and they ultimately get boring, but I thought these were beautiful, and
it's a margarita.
I've never had such a, and so I called the artist, and she was game to do it. She did it within my budget, Marcella. Her name's Marcella Kreibel, and she has great stuff. Look for her site. She sells those wheels as coasters, and she sells all kinds of other stuff, so she's terrific.
So I think we should open it up for questions from the audience. Is there anything? Oh, just one more thing. I want to talk about your YA book, if we can.
Oh yeah, on Tuesday, my YA book, called A Novel, If You Can't Take the Heat, comes out. I'm very excited. It's my first YA. I love writing it. It takes place in Cleveland, the Cleveland of my youth, 1980s Cleveland. And it is about a young man, a privileged young jock who has his sights set on an athletic career, athletic scholarship, who, as the book begins, shatters his leg and dashes his hopes for any kind of career in athletics ever, given the severity of the break. And he is forced, through a girl he meets and falls in love with, to get a job at a high-end French kitchen. And this world of different characters and different socioeconomic backgrounds and different sexualities and the rigors of the kitchen and the drama of the kitchen and a really charismatic chef redirect his life. And that's what that book is out. That comes out Tuesday.
Yeah, so we're very excited about that. He had pitched an idea of writing a cookbook for teenagers. And the editor said, I'm not interested in that, but if you write it as a novel, I'd love to see it. So that's how you came to write it. All right, question.
So let me just say, because I don't know how many people really understand the history of a cocktail.
There's
a history of the cocktail there, and it's 2.5 pages. The whole history of cocktails can be summed up like that. It began in America when we added gin, Dutch-style gin at the time, sugar and bitters, and that became our first cocktail. And that was back in Revolutionary days. Combining sugar and bitters was an English idea that they used for medicinal purposes and tea purposes, but we put alcohol in it. For ages, that and brandy and bitters and sugar was what a cocktail was. Then in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, vermouth arrived, and that was a seismic shift in cocktails. Suddenly, you could create a Manhattan, 1880, with sweet vermouth. Martinis began, which were 2 parts dry vermouth and 1 part gin at the time. So vermouth really allowed everyone to create great martinis, rather great cocktails, and families of cocktails. A specific amount of gin and a liqueur, an orange liqueur, for instance, was common. Orange bitters were ubiquitous before the 1920s, before Prohibition. Prohibition really killed a lot of things. And then the last addition was the idea of a daiquiri or like a Cuba Libre or something like that. Fruit juices could be added to, or the Bronx. The Bronx was another early cocktail that used fruit juice. And so that is how our culture developed cocktails. It was only an American phenomenon. Cocktails at the time were considered something that vulgar, louche young men drank who were just disreputable. But it evolved and evolved until people began loving cocktails and serving great cocktails, like The Last Word, until Prohibition. And then cocktails never really quite recovered. And then by the 60s, even though we were drinking margaritas and things like that, we were using mixes. We were sour mixes instead of lime juice, real juices and real sweetener. And in 1980, so cocktails became trashed. Martinis no longer used vermouth because I think it was because our vermouth was so bad because we were keeping it in the cupboard for 2 years. When it's a wine, it's going to go bad. So you pour that in a drink and the drink is terrible. Leave out the vermouth, please. But then the craft cocktail came around in 1987 with the opening of the Rainbow Room and Dale DeGroff. He was asked by Joe Baum, the legend, the legendary restaurateur, make me a 1930s cocktail regimen. And so he researched all these books, came up with these cocktails. It was a huge hit. He even resuscitated with the glass called a Nick and Nora glass. It's kind of a cross between a martini and a coupe. And he is the reason why people started realizing, oh my God, this cocktail is great. He uses all fresh ingredients, all fresh fruit juices, and careful proportions. And that's the reason, and it just took off from there. The first true craft cocktail bar began in 1994. The second, I believe, was in Cleveland, called the Velvet Tango Room. And then New York started opening up in the early aughts. And that's our cocktail history.
If you could tell just 2 stories, and then people are thinking of their questions about cocktails. The first one is the old-fashioned. I love how it came to be a drink.
The old-fashioned became a drink. As I said, a cocktail was whiskey, bitters, and sugars. But as the new vermouth started coming in, and bartenders were getting frisky with all kinds of, convoluted drinks and stuff, people would come into a bar and say, and looking for a cocktail, and they would just say, would you just give me an old-fashioned cocktail? And it became known as the old-fashioned.
Isn't that great? I love that story. Okay, I had another question, but I forget it.
Perhaps someone else has it. Are there any questions?
Yeah. Questions.
Georgia.
You mentioned, that your dad reminded you of Don Draper, but that made me think of the 2 martini lunch, which was still popular when I was a young adult. Talk about the relationship to cocktails of that reputation of it.
Yeah, he was of that time, and he remembers days he'd get back to his desk and just put his head on his desk. He could not work after 3 martinis. He did not like it. And so they were kind of on their way out because they were just impractical by then. But he was also, my first sip of a martini was at 8. I looked down at my dad's...
And he hasn't stopped.
I looked down at my dad's cup in its little holder, and I said, what's that? And he said, it's martini. Do you want a sip? I said, okay, because I was curious. It tasted awful. I said, oh my God, how can you drink that? He just chuckled, the light turned green, and he headed up Cedar Boulevard. We were on the way to pick up the babysitter. He was having a little roadie. So it's not
it was the 60s.
This was it would have been the late 60s. So that was how cocktails happened in the 60s.
Robin, you had a question.
Yes, I'm interested in these gender stereotypes associated with cooking and I guess education too now. But the cooking part, I was growing up in the 50s, and I think probably 1956, the basketball team, men's basketball team, boys basketball team, Lincoln Junior High School, decided we were going to lobby for the boys cooking club.
God bless you. That's great. That was out of its time.
Wow.
And then we had the boys cooking club. We were
That had to be rare. What part of the country were you in?
Malden, Massachusetts.
Wow. No, the kitchen was the woman's realm in the 50s.
Kind of a breakthrough. I mean, it was like we were departing from.
You were progressive.
Wow, in 9th grade, when I had to take home economics, we cooked, and the boys took shop, it was called, and whatever we made, we used to serve to the boys. I know.
The gender and kind of image association, and then Anthony Bourdain, macho character.
He was a character. I did 5 shows with him, and it was a delight. We did one in Cleveland. We did a couple of fun ones in Vegas. He brought food and cooking, and more its import in understanding cultures and other peoples, which is why he was so great. He was well-read.
Really an anthropologist.
He was an anthropologist. And he was
for sure.
hilarious. Everything that came out of his mouth was funny.
And smart.
And smart.
And he gave Michael an amazing review for your book.
He reviewed, before I knew him, he reviewed Soul of a Chef. They put it prominently on the, they put it right there on the cover. Let us read that. I can't get enough of it. A hold your breath while you turn the page thriller that's also an anthropological study of the culture of cooking. A real rave, and helped put me on the map and started our friendship. And he did just being on a show did wonders for my own career and visibility. So
He was very generous.
Very a generous man to everyone. I did. I actually watched the Cleveland one. I do a pork terrine inlay, and I was terrified I've overcooked it. So we cut into it, and Tony focuses in on the moment of truth. You'll have to watch the episode.
Is it on YouTube? Where can you get it?
Yeah,
it's all streamable. You probably YouTube. Bourdain Cleveland. There's only one Cleveland episode.
Oh, okay.
When
we make a cassoulet together, among the many other things.
When we were first dating, and my daughter was sort of vetting him, and she said, "Mom, sit down. We've got to watch this." And it was him in Las Vegas with Tony, and it's the one episode that we saved. Like we
Really?
had it, yeah, we have it like saved.
I don't think I knew that.
She tracked it down, and we watched it. I was all fluttered.
That was fun. That was fun.
Yeah, Carmen.
I'm wondering, in both of your families, what was the role of why? I know your ethnic background. You told me, and I'm not sure of yours, but you were in a city, and you were growing up in a city as well.
No, I grew up in a little town.
Okay, little town city. So, what was the role of wine?
Oh, the role of wine.
For me,
versus cocktails.
I was in middle to upper class Shaker Heights, Ohio, and my parents were more worldly than other parents. Certainly my mother was. She worked and she traveled for work. She went to India buying dresses for Higbee's, a department in Cleveland. So, and she'd been to Paris, and she was in New York once a month. So wine was, we tried to get decent wine, and I was allowed to have a glass of wine if we were having a red wine fancy dinner in the dining room as opposed to the kitchen, because they wanted me to be discerning about wine. So
and how old were you when you were allowed to have this glass?
I was about 10 or 11. They should have watered the wine down because it burned my throat, and I didn't love that, but I liked the taste of the wine. But they wanted me to be familiar with wines.
So my father was a martini drinker, and I used to mix his martini for him when he got home from work. I also used to polish his shoes. The subservient role I was in is really coming up.
I did not know this. This is good to know.
I loved polishing his shoes. It's so weird. But I made him his martini. He'd walk in with his briefcase, and I'd make his martini. He worked in Boston, and so he used to take the train home to Providence. We lived outside of Providence, but in a little crappy town. But yeah, my mother could not drink anything. It made her cry and sad. So if she had a cocktail, she'd have something like a grasshopper, remember those? Or something equally as disgusting. And then she'd just cry after one. And in fact, she'd visit me in New York, and my then boyfriend was a bartender. He was an actor, so he was a bartender. And I'd say, whatever she orders, don't put liquor in it. And she'd ask for strawberry daiquiri. He'd put no rum, and she'd start crying after one. She'd be like so drunk. You know, and my father and I really there's nothing in that. So I did grow up around those those 60s cocktails, you know, like the grasshopper and like amaretto. We had, my grandmother was Italian. She always drank brandy every night.
Stingers.
Stingers. Oh boy.
Rusty nails.
They drank a lot of stingers at parties. We didn't have wine with dinner. The wine that we had, like my Uncle Rudy made in his basement.
Was there a pecking order? Wine versus cocktails?
No, it was more of a cocktail culture in my
Yeah,
family.
we had cocktail culture too. Wine was for special meals, special occasions in the dining room.
You didn't want Uncle Rudy's wine, trust me, it was terrible.
So every day was cocktails and special occasions wine.
Yeah. Yeah, my parents would always have a Martin. Like, Rip, fix me a Martin. So they both had martinis.
We did have champagne on like special occasions. We had the champagne flute. Well, no, actually we used the
coupes.
The coupes. Yeah. Yeah, Wendy.
So with the cooking and the writing, at the cooking you've got the recipe and the science behind it, and then you've got the intuition. My brother is an amazingly intuitive cook and can invent things.
Yeah.
I'm just a recipe follower. So when you think about like cooking and your writing, where does intuition come into play along with technique and potting and stuff? Do you have any insight about it?
Cooking is very intuitive if you know the fundamental techniques.
Right.
and if you know the basic ratios. Ratios is a great book for people who are intuitive cooks. If you are an inveterate recipe follower,
like me,
I don't think you're going to be thrilled by ratio. Ratio is for a certain minded cook, I think. And of course, cocktail ratios, that's what they're all about. Those are recipes. Baking is different. That's a little more precise, but most of the ratios are baking ratios, actually, is how much flour. But it's important to use a scale because it's all weight-based. If you do weight-based, because a cup of flour can weigh 4 ounces or 6 ounces. If you've got 4 cups of flour, you're going to have 50% difference amounts of flour. So that's why ratios are important to use in baking, and scales are important in using ratios. And writing is half intuition and half hard-earned craft. As I said, I spent 20 years writing before I finally figured out how to write a sentence in a paragraph, in a story. It took 20 years from age 10 till 30. So that's mainly intuition, again, like writing, informed by craft and skills. In fact, we are the only animal that cooks. We're the only animal that tells stories, and I think there's something to be thought about with that fact. Yes, Bryn?
Going from that, can you talk a bit about why you fashioned your book on the elements of style?
Because I love the elements of style. The E.B. White style book, Strunk and White.
Yeah.
I've read that countless times, cover to cover. It's just brilliant, but I love that. So I created a book called The Elements of Cooking, in which it's an opinionated glossary of cooking terms. For instance, bisque is in there, for instance, and pumpkin bisque. It's not a bisque. Bisque denotes shellfish. I talk about salt and the different weights of salt. So it was fun to talk about all these elements in my very opinionated way.
Right.
I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to thank you both for the Friday night cocktails during the weekend. Because I watch them almost every week religiously, and I just got a real kick out of it.
We did the Instagram Live every Friday, making cocktails during the pandemic, and Michael ended each one by reading a poem.
Yes, I like that part too.
We may bring that back this summer.
We're thinking of bringing it back. Yeah. We had fun, and I loved seeing people's names pop up, the same names, and being able to talk to people, and especially because we were so isolated from each other.
So many people.
We couldn't have people come over.
I had no idea strangers say, I loved your Friday cocktail.
We had fun. Yeah. You had a question.
Yeah. First of all, the French Laundry Cookbook is such a beautiful, wonderful book. It's
Deborah Jones did the photography. She's amazing.
So gorgeous. And just a little story. Our grandson is 14 and loves to cook. And he's in Japan with his dad on a conference. And we went to a restaurant last night. And you pick your fish, and then they kill it right there, and that's your sushi. And it was pulsating as he ate it.
Oh my God.
They made 10 different versions of that fish.
Wow. Do you know what the fish was?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
And I don't think he knows either.
Yeah.
But they evidently caught it and showed it, and they made,
that's fantastic.
And at the end, they made a ramen with the fish head.
Wow.
And that was sort of the end of it.
That's brilliant. I think more chefs than not, if they could only eat in one country, would choose Japan.
And the only one that was sort of disgusted with it was his father. He ate everything, but his father really had issues.
How funny.
Yes.
Growing up in Miami, my father loved Manhattan. So from the time I was a young girl and we would go out to eat once in a while, and he would order the Manhattan with extra cherries. So I always got the cherries.
Yeah.
Nice.
To this day, I always remember, eating it. Then I even ate part of the stem, and it was so nice. But it was such a neat ritual.
Yeah.
But I kind of fell in love with cocktails about 20 years ago when I started drinking Cosmos, right? And but now I've really reached the point where I just enjoy a Negroni. I mean, that's my favorite cocktail.
It's the best.
It's the best. Oh, that's funny.
And when I make it at home, I put it in a taller glass, the same proportions of the liquors, but then I will put in like the Pellegrino limon soda to make it taller with a little seltzer, just to make it a taller drink so it lasts a little longer.
That's kind of like a Spagliato?
That's what a Spagliato is.
Yeah.
Oh, where they add.
No, that's
Prosecco.
no, that's an Americano. They add sparkling water. Spagliato, they add a sparkling wine.
Okay.
So you're in a good tradition.
Right, but I don't put the wine. I put the lemon. You know.
Water. So that's an Americano.
Yeah. But I wanted to ask you. So bitters. I have bitters. I use them sometimes, but I really don't understand the bitter.
That's a great question.
It's a great question. They've been around for ages. Again, they began in England as medicinals.
Right.
They're, it's usually a grain alcohol into which bitter ingredients like ginseng root and dried oranges are put into this, and they're extracted, and they're very strong, they're very bitter. There's a good story. There's a great bartender out in Portland named Jeff Morgenthaler, and he has a great story. He ran one of the best cocktail bars in the country, and he'd get some snooty people coming in there, and they're like checking out his things. What kind of bitters do you have here? And he looks at them, he didn't like them already. He says, all three. Angostura, orange, Peychaud's. And that is the case. There are 3 bitters. Now we have bacon bitters, we have chocolate bitters, we have celery bitters, we have peach bitters, these are just companies who want to create more products for us to sell, just like Band-Aids and shampoo. You need 3 bitters. I mean, celery bitters work well in a Trident, for instance. That's a new cocktail. Not worth paying $14 for celery bitters for that cocktail. Celery bitters are nice in a Bloody Mary. We like the Bitterman's chocolate bitters, Mexican chocolate bitters in our Manhattan. Those are great. So when you find outliers like that, that's good. But by and large, 3 bitters. Angostura is the main one. Orange is the classic old-fashioned one. I put a little orange bitters in my martini. And Peychaud's the New Orleans bitters.
So Michael makes such good cocktails. Like our friends just wait for us to invite them over for cocktails. But he changes the proportions, and you'll see that in the book. So could you, the Negroni's one, because sometimes when I order a Negroni, I'm like, it's not right. And also the Manhattan. So can you say what your proportions are?
For the Negroni, I like a 2 to 1 to 1 ratio because I like a stronger cocktail. But I think the perfect Negroni, the 1 to 1 to 1 is too sweet. So I think 1.5 ounces of spirit to 1 ounce Campari to 1 ounce sweet vermouth is the ideal proportion for a Negroni. Manhattan, I just use the chocolate bitters. It's 2 to 1, and you can. What's nice about the Manhattan is you don't need a fancy bourbon. If you use Woodford Reserve, it's just as good as one made with Maker's Mark. So that is just one of those solid cocktails. I look at cocktail lists. I glance at cocktail lists when I go to a restaurant, and I almost never get one of their specialty cocktails. I always stick with one of the classics. Because here's a good example. We went to Selva. They have a list of 8 martinis on their cocktail list. Not a single one contains gin. Not a single one. They all have vodka.
This is a real sore point for Michael, because when he orders a martini, when the bartender says gin or vodka, he's like, I just ordered a martini. It's gin. And if it has vodka, it's actually called
a kangaroo. That is the name. In the way that Rob Roy is a Manhattan made with scotch, a kangaroo is a gin martini made with vodka.
What would be the reasoning for that, for Selva to make that decision?
What would be the reasoning?
Yeah.
It's because men don't want to order a kangaroo.
No,
Why did Selva not have any gin martinis, do you think?
That I have no friggin' idea. It's because vodka has steamrolled this country. It's lobotomized this country. It's a spirit that is by nature, by definition, flavorless. So if you want to get drunk, drink vodka. Fine, go ahead. If you want to enjoy a cocktail, it's not. Though a Cosmo is not bad. A Cosmo is in the margarita family, which is in the book. It's not a bad cocktail.
But Smirnoff actually was a big marketing campaign. That's how we were
all. They did it.
Yeah.
It was in James Bond. James Bond has harmed cocktails no end. You should always stir a martini, never shake a martini, please.
I had a question about people ordering vodka on the rocks, gin on the rocks.
I'm afraid
And I don't really get it, because they really, anytime you mix something, it usually enhances the flavor and gives you a little depth rather than even just taking a tiny bit of vermouth with good gin it tastes better if you add a little bit
of something to it.
A little bit more, like a half an ounce for an ounce and a half.
I couldn't agree more. I don't know. I'm very judgmental about these people. I don't say anything.
It's all flavored oils, right? Like the high-end vodkas are just like, my brother's in the business, and it's just like, it's a marketing thing where they make it taste high-end, but it's just drops of stuff. It's not better quality.
No, it's not better quality. Vodka doesn't give you any less of a hangover than any other spirit. What gives you a hangover is drinking too much.
I have one last question. How has you spent all of this time with these chefs, these cooks, and I think they're known to be quite disciplined, right? So I'm wondering how your time spent in the kitchen has informed your practice of writing.
The answer to that is actually a good one. When we were back home, my ex-wife and sat me down at the kitchen table, and said, "Michael, we're going to be broke in 4 months. You need to write this book in 4 months, The Making of a Chef." And before I learned to cook, well, boys themselves took 9 months, and I was hauling ass even then. You can't write a book in 4 months. But I didn't think like that anymore. I was taught to get there. If I needed to write a book in 4 months, I'd write a book in 4 months. I went to the contract, found out I had to be 90,000 words, divided that by the number of days we had left to be financially solvent. I figured out, and from that I determined if I wrote 1,400 words a day, 5 days a week, save Saturdays for revision, Sundays for rest, I'd have a book in time. And I did, without fail. Holidays or no, kids are sick, doesn't matter. I got my 1,400 words done every day. And I realized what Pardis had taught me. We're surprised what we're capable of if we don't have a choice. That's how it informed me. Their discipline, just being organized, having a sense of urgency. I mean, a cook who's in charge of the braised items doesn't tell chef when the first braises were, "Sorry, I had braised block today, chef. I didn't get to the short ribs." I couldn't get writer's block. And I realized there's no such thing as real writer's block. I think Anne agrees with me. You might write badly, you might throw the pages out, but writer's block is an excuse. And that's one thing that chef's work taught me.
I have to ask you to say one more thing about that, which is Michael also studied in college under the writer Reynolds Price, and he also helped you develop the habit. Can you talk about that, the writing habit?
Reynolds Price, author of A Long and Happy Life, and Kate Vaden, and plays and essays, was so important. He gave me the 2 things I needed to know in order to become a writer. He knew I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be a writer badly, had been since 5th grade. He said, 2 things you have to understand. The first is that so much of writing fiction, any writing, any creative writing, all writing is creative, it takes place in the unconscious. So much of what we work on happens when we're not even thinking about the writing, but your brain is working on it. In the same way, when you can't come up with that word, and then 4 hours later, you say, "Oh, verisimilitude, that was what I was trying to think of." That's because your brain has been working on it without you even thinking about it. Well, the unconscious also works on your writing projects. And he said, the unconscious is like children and dogs. It loves routine and it hates surprises. And he said, therefore, in order to get your unconscious to work for you, you need to train it. You need to write every day at the same time, for the same amount of time, and produce about the same amount of words. And I took that to heart. At first it was 350 words. And I did that for years, until I was writing Making of a Chef, when I realized I could write 1,400 words a day. The second thing he taught me was, when you're a writer, you have to be a ruthless manager of your own time. No one is going to do it for you. You have to be ruthless about this. And that is why I have a schedule. And it's always writing at the same time of day for the same amount of time. Right now I write about 1,000 words a day when I'm working on a fictional project or a nonfiction project. Good rules for any writer in my book.
Yeah.
They allowed me to become a writer.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
One last question.
One last question.
So
Patricia.
how does your
philosophy of just get there work in your relationship?
She becomes impatient with me, I think. I'm a little too dogmatic about how things should be done and efficiency and things like that. I don't know, what would you say?
I don't agree. I would say that his just getting there means he's always present in a relationship. I just told you that this morning.
You did. So sweet.
I wasn't listening.
No, I did. It was really sweet.
Yeah.
It was almost effusive. I didn't know where it was coming from. It was so nice. Anyway, thank you all. I can answer more questions and sign books. I'll stick around.
I just have
one last question.
I just have one last comment.
Oh.
I think from what I'm hearing from you, underneath it all, underneath everything, you're really a mathematician.
A what?
A mathematician.
She called me a mathematician. Well, I'll take it. I'll take it because they are organized and methodical in their thinking.
Proportions, everything. The
true.
Ratios,
True. The division. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you all.
So much.
Really appreciate it. This has been fun.